Thank you very much for joining our special dialogue hosted by Global Health Innovation Policy Program at GRIPS. My name is Hiromi Murakami of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, facilitating this dialogue series. We're honored to welcome a distinguished guest today from Washington, D.C., Dr. Paul Linehan, who is an expert on U.S.-China strategic relations in business, trade, intelligence, and national security affairs. At Global Health Innovation Policy Program, we are also engaging crisis management project, and today's session is a joint dialogue of health security and crisis management project. We'd like to thank U.S. Embassy for the support, and the crisis management project is funded by United States of Government. Today, we're so fortunate to have Dr. Paul Linehan, who had served 35 years in the U.S. government and has in-depth knowledge on China from various aspects. Especially his insights are very valuable as we face such an unforeseeable situation today, and U.S.-China geostrategic competition is a hot issue. We sincerely appreciate a comprehensive perspective of Dr. Linehan. Now, we'd like to invite Dr. Michishita for opening remarks. Dr. Michishita is a vice president and a member of board of trustees of GRIPS, and he's a leading expert on security issues. And he's also an advisor to Global Health Innovation Policy Program Crisis Management Project. Please welcome Dr. Michishita.
We are living in the world in which there are many challenges posed by global geopolitical changes, regional conflicts, and infectious diseases like COVID-19. However, we have not been able to find a way to respond to those challenges effectively. GRIPS is striving to nurture future global leaders who can understand why and how those challenges are emerging, and devise an effective and sustainable means of tackling them. In that context, I am most delighted to welcome Dr. Paul Linehan, who will enlighten us today on how health and environmental issues play their roles in the great power competition between the United States and China, and how we might be able to respond to that. Dr. Linehan lived in Japan for 1 year between 2002 and 2003 as a Mansfield Fellow. And as GRIPS always works very closely with the Mansfield Foundation and actually organizes presentation sessions for Mansfield Fellows. Well, when he was in Japan, we were not doing that. So he wasn't, couldn't do it. But we are working very closely together. So we are extremely happy to have one of former Mansfield Fellows with us today. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Michishita. So let me introduce today's speaker, Dr. Paul Linehan. Dr. Linehan is a security expert specializing in global health security affairs, future technology advantage, emerging threats, strategic risk analysis and mitigation. And also, he's an adjunct lecturer at the U.S. Department of State Foreign Service Institute, Boston College, and Keio University. He is a senior fellow at the China and Indo-Pacific Security Affairs Division, Center of Naval Analysis. Dr. Linehan's 35 years of professional experience and federal government service have been devoted to managing a range of Indo-Pacific business, defense, intelligence, and national security affairs. In his final assignment in the Office of Undersecretary of Defense and Policy, he served as a director in the Pacific for the National Disclosure Policy Committee. Dr. Linehan was a U.S. Congressional Fellow of the Government of Japan in the Ambassador Mike Mansfield Fellowship Program, and as a Leadership Exchange Fellow to the People's Republic of China in partnership with Tsinghua and Johns Hopkins Universities. He is a graduate of Boston College, holds master's degree in Johns Hopkins University's School of Advanced International Studies, the National War College, National Defense University and received a doctorate from Georgetown University. He's a recipient of the Secretary of Defense Exceptional Civilian Service Award and the author of the book, The Culture of Leadership in Contemporary China, Conflict, Values, and Perspective for the New Generation. Let me also introduce Dr. Kiyoshi Kurokawa, Professor Emeritus at GRIPS, Head of Global Health Innovation Policy Program, who will be our commentator today. He has long been involved in global health policy, and of course, COVID-19. He is a member of World Dementia Council, International Scientific Advisory Committee, and many other institutions. So with that, I'd like to pass the microphone to Dr. Linehan. We greatly appreciate that you're taking time for us today. It's all yours.
Okay, so today's briefing is going to be, like I mentioned, it's basically 4 slides. I'd like to speak to about maybe 5 to 8 minutes per slide. And before I go into the slides, what I'd like to do is set some of the background for the strategic environment that we're going to discuss. What I would also like to mention is that all of the comments here this evening are all my own comments, and they do not represent any of the organizations that I'm affiliated with. So I think what we recognize is that with the US, China, and Japan, there's a lot of interdependency between the world's top 3 economies. I think what happened during COVID is that prior to COVID, I think US-China relations were somewhat toxic, and I think the COVID pandemic accelerated a lot of feelings between the US and China that led to discussion of potential decoupling. So I think what happened was, due to the COVID, there was a growing international suspicion of what happened with regard to the actual COVID information that was coming out. And then there was a lot of lack of transparency. And then unfortunately, there was a lot of sort of diversionary tactics, laying the blame on potential sources like the United States, et cetera, for the COVID-19 virus. All right, let me go back to talking about the world's top 3 economies and how the COVID pandemic sort of accelerated US feelings of potential decoupling from China. So what happened was the international suspicion over what happened with the COVID-19 virus origins led to a lot of negativity and sort of like concerns over China's response and lack of transparency. And then unfortunately, there were sort of diversion excuses or information about different sources of the COVID virus that or originated outside of China. So I think what happened was this growing lack of trust and confidence during the pandemic was unfortunate for China, because what it did was it raised questions about China as a reliable source of business, manufacturing, and supply chain goods. And the questions about reliability and uncertainty caused some nations to reassess and also diversify their sources of the strategic stockpiles, manufacturing, research and development, as well as their own sort of supply chain assurance. So leading up to this, I think what is important to note is that in the last decade, you had 3 very strong leaders emerge in the 3 countries. So Prime Minister Abe in 2012, and then President Xi in 2013, and then President Trump in 2016. And what happened was each, I believe, sought to establish policies on economic prosperity and a robust reputational standing in the international community. And I think what happened was originally globalization was the expectation of this decade, but that kind of led, as I mentioned, toward feelings of trade wars and financial market collapse and potential territory disputes. And then there were questions about interconnectedness of globalization, and there was a shift towards more self-reliance. And before I go to the first slide, I'd just like to mention that if you look at the 3 nations that we're discussing tonight, the US desires continued military predominance, trade liberalization, and then spreading of democratic values. And I think what we experienced is that during the Trump administration, there was a little bit of go it alone feeling. And I think that President Biden take over now is looking at trying to instill a sense of trust in the international community. So I think in this situation as well, China desired continued comprehensive modernity, internal stability, territorial sovereignty, and then again, international leadership, legitimacy and respect. So I think that China was seeking to look at ways to make its own standing in the geopolitical context. And then finally, what I'd like to mention with Japan, I think Japan desired peace, stability, domestic and international prosperity, and also predictability from a rules-based order and pushing forward with the free and open Indo-Pacific. So I'll kind of go into my slides and we'll talk to these issues. That kind of sets the stage. So here's the briefing summary I have for the 4 slides. So for the first one, let's move right into it. Okay, so in the geostrategic competition, I think what we're looking at in terms of objectives and context, there is some question right now is that the United States might be strategically vulnerable. And I think in this regard, the US is looking to shore up and build and rebuild foundations of its power, leadership, and global order. I think what the United States is trying to do with President Biden is to win back some trust and confidence in the international community. But there remains a question about, is China going to seek to displace the US from this position? So there is questions about what is the objective of the long-term strategic competition with China? And then questions about, is it inevitable or is it something that the US should force to compete, in this, because this was a big issue that I think the Biden administration pushed forward with, is that the message of the US is back and the US is trying to build back better. And then the US is trying to win back its allies and partners in terms of trust and confidence. But essentially, it's been laid out as a battle of values and ideology. And so in response to this, what we've seen, I think, in the US is a really whole of nation approach, not just a whole of government approach. I think what you see is that the United States is seeking to have a complete comprehensive orchestration of government, the private sector, and then look at innovation as a key factor so that the United States can indeed compete with China. But in order to do this, I think it's important, the last part here is that the US needs its allies, partners, and like-minded nations. There's been a lot of discussion about close and continuous coordination, and then the discussion about like-minded allies, et cetera. But are the like-minded nations of really like-mindedness? And I pointed to the issues of like the Quad, the AUKUS, and then, where does Korea stand in this? And then, with the issue of the CPTPP, and then of course the issue of Taiwan. And I'd like to get into that in some of the dialogue later, because again, we've transitioned from Taiwan being a relatively low-key issue between the US and China in the recent years, but then more recently, you've seen it elevate to the point where the United States is really engaging with Taiwan to the dismay of China. So I think against this backdrop across the globe, I think countries are asking themselves that they like US security, but then they like Chinese economic opportunity and they shouldn't have to choose. So I think this is a critical aspect, is that no one really wants to see, I believe, in the international community, a situation of strategic competition that would actually really create separate and disparate systems. So this is something that needs to be reckoned with in terms of some of the countries that are looking forward to which way is it going to, the outcome is going to be. So the last 2 bullets, like I like to talk to, is that the US has reached out to European partners to look at the Trade and Technology Council, where they're looking at greater coordination in terms of trade, supply chain, and then also the other issues of ICT security, as well as data governance. And then, of course, as we're talking about this evening, or today rather, climate and green technologies. I think Japan is recognizing how all these issues are affecting its own national security strategy. And I think it's no surprise that everybody realizes, and there's been recent movements to push forward with a national economic security strategy. And then there's a question about how this would comport with a democratic technology alliance that perhaps the United States is seeking to achieve. And then how would Japan be able to implement and influence any strategies of its own economic security with the democratic technology alliance. Okay, so we're talking about the geostrategic competition, as I mentioned, that the US objectives feeling that it's being displaced by China and pushing back against that. And then the Biden administration looking to push forward with its message that the US is back and trying to win back confidence and support of its allies to build back better. And then essentially the strategic competition between China and the US being a battle of values and ideology. So in response to this, the US is taking a very whole of nation approach, not just a whole of government, where it's enlisting, it's a public-private partnership, and especially in terms of the innovation sector. And then the last slide, as I mentioned, about the US cannot go it alone, that it needs its partners and allies to move forward, kind of close and continuous coordination, when most of the globe feels that why should they choose? Because they like US security guarantees and Chinese economic opportunity. And then lastly, like I mentioned about the Japanese economic security strategy, I think everybody in the sort of democratic, so-called democratic technology alliance realizes that the issue of economic security is a national security issue. It's not just national security issues or military and diplomacy and defense type issues, is that the national economic security strategies are critical for everybody. So now I'm going to the US-China competition considerations. As I mentioned about decoupling, I think a lot of people feel that it's probably not realistic to be decoupling across the board. So I think that the US is looking at smart decoupling, and by that I mean limited to critical emerging technologies in the 14 categories that the US has identified as being key or sort of crown jewel technologies. So this is where the realization for US businesses, decoupling is not practical because it's just limiting US business ability to compete in China. So there's some discussion that maybe with really advanced technologies, there'll be two different global operating systems. And so that's where we're talking about how both China and the US are pushing forward with restrictive laws and policies for tighter technology trade and exports, as well as sharing data, sensitive data, or restricting foreign direct investment coming into the country. And then I mentioned that there's a question, how do other countries approach this if they feel that the US and China are inversely passing each other in terms of strategic decline and strategic rise? Okay, so now we go into a little bit of the post-COVID environment, and then how health and environment issues may be an area of cooperation and trust. So I think, as I mentioned, under health, with the global supply chain disruption, I think everybody started to consider that for critical technologies that perhaps there should be more self-reliance. So even though these issues are critical, there's still an issue with relying or depending on China for things like medical equipment, PPE, and in some cases medicine. But I think what the United States and other nations would like to do is diversification. And I think for the United States, it did its own supply chain review, whereby it looked at an executive order to make sure that the United States is responsible for its own economic prosperity and national security. So it comes to, I think what we're talking about is the environment, right? I mean, this is a critical issue. And I think with everything going on right now and COP26 going to meet, what will be the opportunities that are here between the US, China as leading nations on these issues, and then also in the globe, right? So how will everybody try to move forward with some agreement while the United States and China try to limit talking past each other, right? So I think one of the difficulties is for COVID-19 and moving forward in that regard, I think it's still unresolved how the origins of COVID-19 are looked at and how to prevent a future pandemic. But I think this is something that we need to really discuss, whether it's in the United Nations or in the global community, because this is such a critical issue that I think it's incumbent upon China to own some of this and describe, not wait for an opportunity to be asked what to do. It's an issue where China should propose what it intends to do to avoid maybe a repeat.
I think your paper is hitting the microphone. Yep.
Sorry. Okay. So the global challenge, I think, is to put aside ideology and not really have it as a strategic weapon or tool, right? To have these kind of discussions on health and environment cooperation. And I think that for China wants to have a broader discussion on eliminating a lot of the tensions and disagreements first and try to repair the relationship, then discuss the health and environment issues. So I think there's a feeling perhaps not only with Japan, but across the globe, is that a lot of countries feel they don't want to be caught in the middle. And so in this regard, I think here we are with Japan, they could potentially have a really critical role in this situation because it's in Japan's national interest because of the proximity and all of the issues relative to COVID and also environment because of, like we talked about, the there's acid rain and pollution issues that are really important for Japan to resolve with China. So as I mentioned, next week we have a very important meeting, COP26. But I think what's a question is, what's the practicality to really accelerate phasing out a lot of the issues relative to either coal or fossil fuels? And what's happened is that I think a lot of nations are realizing that it's a very expensive endeavor. And the United States is also wrestling with this question right now as it's trying to pass its own legislation. There's also a question about like electric vehicles rather. What is the actual pollution discharge that you may be getting it just from vehicles, but then you still rely on, you have to plug into power plant, et cetera, for recharging your vehicles. And I think there are more options than just electronic vehicles. And then, there's a question about fossil fuel producers that would be strengthened and advantaged, and the less developed world would rely on that still because it's not something they can change very quickly. So there's a question about practicality in terms of, climate change cooperation and accelerating the environmental green technologies and legislation that be required. So I think the issue here, I think, is to connect these issues as a global security issue whereby everyone has a vested interest in improving our quality of life and to have stability and prosperity for everybody. So I think that we should focus on a fundamental priority for baseline standards for global health and environment. And I think everybody should look at these issues for health and environment not really like a soft power secondary issue, but an essential element of every nation's comprehensive national power. So in the last slides, I just wanted to offer is that I think what's critical in the U.S.-Japan strategic, U.S. and China strategic competition is that there's a critical role for Japan to be in this. And I think with regard to China, I think the emphasis should not necessarily be just on like what's our shared interest, but we have to focus on shared outcomes. And by doing that, I believe that we have, if we have created mutually beneficial interdependency, this is something that I think would be in both countries' interest to advance greater cooperative endeavors. And then lastly, what I'd like to offer before we go to the Q&A is that there is a leadership role for Japan here, I believe, because I think everybody recognizes Japan as a tremendous leader for having advanced technologies, as well as having a culture of very orderly, innovative, and disciplined problem solving on health and environment issues. So with that, I'd like to stop, and I apologize for all the technical glitches on my end, but I'd like to just sort of open it up for questions if we could do that.
Thank you very much. For people who are listening to, please send us a question through this Q&A box if you have one. So let me start question for Dr. Linehan. You talked about, the importance of economic security. I think the Japanese government also created this, position, newly position for the minister position. So, Japan is also very concerned with this aspect. So having, because you're an expert in risk and management and analysis, so having this COVID-19, we experienced this, well, while having COVID-19, but also having this U.S.-China strategic competition, why do you see the most the potential, risk that can be deteriorated from this situation? What is the worst scenario that we have to be really prepared?
Well, I think the issue is one of trust. I think there's a lot of ongoing discussion between the U.S. and China about any potential miscalculation or miscommunication. And so this is something that also bleeds over into the health issues because of like COVID-19. There's an issue of trust and sort of transparency. So I think the issue is one of how do we have confidence building measures that we can have confidence that the information being shared by both sides for international health and environmental issues are sort of reach a common ground and common understanding. But as I mentioned, it cannot be separated from the national security issues, national security trust issues that still exist between the US and China. I think there's a lot of suspicion about US intentions about engaging with Taiwan. This is something that's very close to Japan, and I believe many Japanese, are aware or should be aware of potential for contingency and realizing China's statements about sovereignty issues. So this is something that I think is a critical issue, is that having trust, having dialogue, having common understanding is something across the board, whether we're talking about defense and security issues, or we're talking about health and environmental issues. And then also the last thing, as you mentioned, with the economic security strategy, are the economic, trade, and cooperative issues between the US and Japan and China, et cetera, is there confidence that those technologies and that kind of data is being used for commercial civil uses and not necessarily military uses? So that's a great concern as well in terms of, economic security and confidence. Yeah. Okay,
so we have one question from the audience. So this is about the Afghanistan, that she said, any wisdom around what is happening in Afghanistan, what China commented vis-a-vis USA, and the US strategic priorities shift? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. So I think a lot of issues with Afghanistan fell on two sides, because I think in one regard, I think the United States had made clear that it was going to exit Afghanistan at this point after 20 years of sustained war and trillions of dollars, et cetera, and many loss of life around, both in Afghanistan and in coalition forces, et cetera. I think it reached a point where it was decided that the government in Afghanistan should be left up to its people to decide their future. And then, of course, we saw the issues with the U.S. withdrawal. And then the secondary issue is that, shaking confidence in the U.S. as a reliable partner. So I think there was some issues about, is the U.S. going to be committed? But I think that Afghanistan is not like our treaty allies that we have across the globe. I think that we have mutual defense and security treaties that have been long-standing. I think we have U.S. military presence across the globe with our allies and partners. So I think that the U.S. commitment is there. But I also think that China will take the opportunity to criticize the U.S. and point that it's not a reliable partner. And then it's making its own overtures into Afghanistan. But then there's some questions about, are they doing it altruistically, that they're interested in helping the Afghan people, or are they going after rare earth elements supplies that are there, and then maybe tying that into their Belt and Road Initiative? So, I think that the issues are important to consider, but it's never completely black and white. I think there are two issues or several issues, facets to consider when you look at that issue. Thank you.
Thank you. So let me maybe go back to the Taiwan issue that you mentioned previously, that, you said for Afghan, maybe US is not committed as much as other regions, but Taiwan is one of the very important area that well, you're the expert, so I don't know much about, what we should be anticipating, if something happens. And could you maybe show or tell us how you see if anything might happen and then it might be affecting to, US, Japan, China relations in that regard?
Yeah, so I think everybody realizes that Taiwan is a very sensitive issue. I think that the telephone call between President Xi and President Biden were trying to allay some of the concerns between the issue of, is the United States changing a position, looking at supporting Taiwan, sort of moving toward, some sort of independent or status, or is the U.S. looking to support Taiwan beyond its traditional role as governed by the Taiwan Relations Act? So there were a lot of questions that came forward. And I think President Xi, on his part, he made it very clear as a policy statement that, Taiwan is inevitably part of China, and that it's his stated policy goal to bring Taiwan back into the China's fold. And so, as you know, with the U.S. position of strategic ambiguity, the U.S. continues to support Taiwan's ability for defensive weapons, because I think the United States does not support reunification by force, that type of issue. But then there's a lot of issues, health and environment, and then also trade issues that Taiwan serves as a very good example to engage. I think you look at the semiconductor industry, it's a critical industry. Taiwan is a leader in this regard, so they have demonstrated capability for advanced technology innovation and development. So there's a lot that Taiwan could actually contribute in this regard. And then it comes to the issue of course, military sort of escalation or provocation, increased Chinese military aircraft entering, airspace that's been traditionally sort of off limits by both sides to avoid potential confrontation. But I think this is something that both countries, I think for the US and Japan and other countries are looking at, is how do they engage with Taiwan in a meaningful way where Taiwan is allowed to contribute all of its advanced knowledge in some of the areas I mentioned, but then not antagonize China, and then also ensure that, overall a free and open Indo-Pacific means that there's free and open trade and access. So this is something that I think is worth looking at. I think the government of Japan and the US government and our respective militaries are looking at ways to maintain stability and peace, but also be prepared, as you mentioned, for any possible contingencies. But I think this is an awareness that I think is required in both the US public and the Japanese public to understand, how close Taiwan really is to Japanese territorial waters and land. And that, any kind of issue that would be in that proximity would be a national security concern of Japan and of course the United States as an Indo-Pacific power. Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you. So there's another question from the audience. Is there any chance that China withdraw its naval force from Japan Sea, and how can we achieve that? This is the biggest threat to Japan, and if it's withdrawn, Japan's position with China will become much proactive. What do you think of that?
Yeah, I think China has actually been very active in sort of the gray Navy, the gray areas of using, Coast Guard vessels for like coastal patrol, but at the same time using it to enforce its claims for territorial sovereignty over the 9-dash line in the South China Sea, as well as being very assertive in the East China Sea. I don't know if it's as simple as stopping, kind of sea patrols, and then, if China would slow down or decrease those patrols, then that could lead to, greater cooperation. I think from an intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance perspective, I think that all countries that have a Navy, they want to exercise the Navy and have what they call maritime domain awareness, right? So be aware of what's out there in their seas in terms of threats or issues that they need to be aware of. So I don't know. I don't know if China would decrease or stop those types of maritime surveillance activities, and then actually pushing the envelope as we witnessed that, Russian and Chinese ships crossed between, Hokkaido and Honshu the other day. So it's kind of leads to escalation, and it could lead to potential miscommunication and miscalculation when we have these kind of incidents. So I think that dialogue would be good. And I think, mill-to-mill dialogue, military-to-military dialogue is a first place to start about how to take de-escalation measures. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So another question, how would the US take a strong initiative internationally on public health vis-a-vis China? What should the WHO reform itself to recover member countries' government and people's trust?
Yeah. Well, I think that's a really good question. And I think we have to look at, sort of what had occurred during the Trump administration when I believe that the United States kind of pulled back from, the Paris Climate Treaty, and then also within the UN. Chinese diplomats actually stepped forward in a lot of these, WHO and other international organizations and UN organizations. I believe they lead somewhere like 15 sort of committees dealing with health and environment. So I think one of the issues is when it comes to health and environment, it can't be the United States like asking China to do something. I think China, if it's taking a leading role, must propose first what it intends to do to win back international trust. Because like I mentioned, is that, COVID, it originated in China. There's questions about how it originated, right? Was it natural or was it an accident? And there's still sort of unanswered questions about that. Mm-hmm. So in terms of taking a lead for such health issues like that, I think that's something that the international community is waiting to see what China would propose in terms of, taking that lead. What would they do to internationalize and seek international help for solutions to these health crises? And then also, at the same token, for the environmental issues, there was a commitment by President Xi to stop coal-fired plants funded overseas. But then we've seen recently, they kind of walked back some of that as, coal continues to move forward. You've got rising gas prices and coal as an alternative for now. It's not so easy to just suddenly stop and go this way. But that said, I know China is moving forward with, electric vehicles and other potential hydrogen vehicles and, low emission vehicles or hybrids, et cetera. So they are making some efforts. But again, I think unless the international community works together, I mean, if you remember what happened with fluorocarbons, the spray, within a few years, I think we had a global agreement and we were able to get rid of that and move forward. I think we need to really try to focus that. And I'm hopeful that, this conference in Glasgow will lead to some effort and expectation that if China wants to be a true global leader, then it has to propose what it will do or what it would like other nations to do to help it in a cooperative endeavor. Thank you.
Right.
Thank you. So we have Dr. Kurokawa, who is our commentator today. So would Dr. Kurokawa, would you like to ask questions or make comment?
Yeah, perhaps the comment is how the sort of EU's, Europeans' role, they could do more to China because there's a sort of belt and all the things, and they have a different sort of relations. And I think they could do more on this issue because we are talking about China, Japan, US, but I think EU has a lot of potential, I think, working on this issue because world becomes smaller and smaller, and the EU is a very important element and also partner on this issue, in my view.
Yes, sir. I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that with the Biden administration really doing outreach to the European Union, I think the expectation is that that there would be a different dialogue that the European Union could have with China that the United States really couldn't. So I would agree with you on that regard. I think the issue is like, bilaterally also with different countries. Each country has a unique relationship with China, whether it be Germany or France, et cetera. So there's both like on a bilateral basis and then also kind of on a multilateral basis from the EU perspective. But also I think the US, with what I mentioned was the European Union, US Trade and Technology Council, is that they're looking at ways to make sure that there's not an undercut policy that would go forward, which means, as you know, that if the US restricts certain trade of advanced technologies with China, that the European Union doesn't jump in that void and disadvantage the United States. So there's looking at how to have close and continuous cooperation and consultation in that regard. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. So maybe final question for me is, like, you mentioned that Japan can play a role in this, but what sort of role that you envision that Japan can and should play?
Right. Well, of course, I mean, I think this is something that is critical in terms of, I think China respects Japan for its long history that they've had. And I think that there's a lot of business between Japan and China that would give Japan a lot of influence in China. And I think that Japan's own, like I mentioned, advanced technology development, and then its own approach to health and very disciplined approach toward looking at, clean environment, environmental issues, etc. This might be something that Japan could create like a standard that would be a good model for China to follow. But again, I think what we need to do is separate a little bit of the national security defense issues of the strategic competition and look at how do we really focus on something maybe more common and more innocuous, not as threatening. And I think in health and environment, this is something that I think we could get cooperation on. And as I mentioned, for all those reasons, I think Japan is a key partner in that regard. Kurokawa Sensei, I wanted to mention also that Mr. Tsukada at the embassy here, he said, I saw him yesterday, and he said, please pass on his best regards to you and his appreciation for all your help and guidance when he was working these issues.
I think, thank you. I was just happened to be thinking about him in Washington, D.C. right now. I was thinking the same thing. So just send my message to him too.
Absolutely, sir. Thank you.
Very good man.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. I appreciate it. I'll let him know. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you very much. It was very valuable discussion, and thank you for such an insight and broader perspective.
Appreciate all of your patience with me here, dealing with the technical issues, but this is a really important issue, and I appreciate GRIPS for all your support and your work in this area, and I wish you all the health and safety to continue moving forward, and hopefully we get to see everybody in person.
Thank you. Yeah, hope to see you soon in Japan. And Dr. Mitsushita, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Linehan, for the presentation and your response.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. With this, we're closing this session and appreciate everybody's participation. Thank you very much, and see you next time. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.